can't bear this bloody thing. What they do is every stinking thing.
There was no balcony appearance, no state trumpet, no carefully staged family photograph. Instead, behind the thick walls of a royal residence, where history has often moved in silence, long before it moves in public, King Charles is said to have revealed a palace letter so sensitive, so deeply personal, and so politically dangerous that even seasoned royal staff understood at once that this was not another family misunderstanding. It was a turning point, because the letter did not merely speak to Prince Harry's past, it reached forward into his royal future, and in doing so, forced the monarchy to confront one of the most painful questions it has tried for years to postpone. What place, if any, remains for a son who walked away, a prince who spoke out, and a family that never fully stopped loving him, even while it stopped trusting him? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Because what happened around this letter was not routine palace housekeeping. It was the kind of royal development that reshapes old loyalties, reopens buried wounds, and changes how the future of the crown is being quietly imagined. Britain expected another ordinary phase in a story that had already exhausted so many headlines. Another period of distance, another round of silence, another careful appearance from one side and another interpreted message from the other. But this time felt different from the beginning. This was not a rumor about whether Harry might attend one event or skip another. It was not speculation about a title in conversation, a seating plan, or an awkward glance caught by cameras. This was about a letter, a palace letter, reportedly revealed by the king himself, and understood to contain terms, expectations, and consequences that could redefine Prince Harry's standing for years to come. That mattered, because in royal life, letters are never just letters. A palace letter can be many things. It can be a private communication. It can be an internal statement of expectation. It can be a formal expression of personal will wrapped in institutional language. It can even become, without ever being called law, a governing document of family conduct. Royal households often move through notes, memoranda, private communications, and sealed guidance long before the public sees any result. And when such a letter is revealed by the sovereign, rather than leaked by a courtier, it means one thing above all: the private matter has become too important to remain private. The first shock was not simply that the letter existed. Many inside royal circles likely suspected that some written framework had to exist by now. The real shock was that Charles chose to reveal it, or at least reveal enough of it, at a moment when the family had been struggling to preserve even the appearance of managed distance. That suggested a breaking point. It suggested that the old strategy of hoping time would soften the Harry question had failed. And it suggested something even more difficult. The king may have concluded that uncertainty itself had become a threat to the monarchy's stability. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. Because for the public, the story looked like a dramatic royal development about status, inclusion, and consequence. But inside the House of Windsor, the letter carried another meaning. It was evidence that the father-son wound had reached a stage where feeling could no longer be allowed to drift without structure. This was not a sentimental note from a father begging a son to return. It was not a public punishment either. It was something more devastating than both. It was a boundary drawn in the language of royal continuity. When the first private reactions began to take shape, they were marked not by spectacle, but by stillness. William, according to those believed to understand the atmosphere around him, received the revelation with a kind of hard restraint. He had long ago stopped expecting easy resolution where Harry was concerned. Yet even he reportedly felt the weight of the moment. Because once a king reveals a letter that bears on a prince's future, the issue is no longer emotional fallout from old family rows. It becomes succession adjacent. It becomes structural. And William knew that anything structural inside the monarchy echoes far beyond the personal. Catherine, as so often, is believed to have seen the human and institutional danger at the same time. She understood that a letter can close one chapter while opening another far more painful one. If the king had put Harry's future into written terms, then the family was no longer dealing only with unresolved feeling. They were dealing with administered distance. That kind of distance is different. It does not fade after a difficult weekend or soften after a holiday gesture. It enters the archive. It enters the household understanding. It becomes part of how future decisions are justified. Charles himself, those close to the wider palace mood suggest, appeared grave, even by his own restrained standards. This was not triumph. It was not anger performed as authority. It was the visible exhaustion of a man who understood that being king had not released him from being a father, but had instead forced him to be both at once, in the least forgiving circumstances imaginable. A monarchy can absorb scandal. It can absorb criticism. It can even absorb absence. But it struggles when uncertainty sits too close to the line of continuity. And Harry, whether inside the institution or outside it, has remained tied to that line by blood, memory, and the public's refusal to stop caring. Yet to understand why this letter carried such force, it is necessary to go back. The story did not begin with its revelation. It did not even begin with one interview, one departure, or one accusation. The decision was not born that day. It grew slowly, over years, through repeated disappointments, carefully contained embarrassments, private discussions that failed, and a deepening recognition within the palace that what had once been treated as a temporary estrangement was gradually becoming a permanent constitutional discomfort. The truth was more painful. When Harry stepped away from the working structure of royal life, the palace initially behaved as institutions often do, in moments of emotional confusion. It created temporary language for what it hoped would remain a temporary fracture. Transitional terms were discussed. Working arrangements were softened. Respectful ambiguity was allowed to do what direct confrontation could not. A transition period was, in simple terms, a space in which the institution postpones finality in the hope that relationships may stabilize before permanent lines are drawn. That approach made sense at first. The family was wounded. The public was watching. The future still looked flexible, but flexibility became strain. The problem was never only that Harry left. The deeper issue was that he left while still carrying the full symbolic force of royal identity into a public life increasingly defined by separation from the very institution that had shaped him. He was not an ordinary former employee. He was a prince by birth, a son of the king, brother of the future king, and a figure whose every statement about royal life landed not as commentary from outside, but as testimony from within. That made him uniquely difficult for the monarchy to process. He could not simply be erased, yet he could not continue to occupy a blurred space forever. What happened next requires going back to a lesser-known palace incident, one that reportedly did far more to harden attitudes than the public ever understood. It occurred during preparations for a sensitive royal event in which questions of family presence, ceremonial rank, and public optics had to be quietly coordinated. Such planning is not glamorous, but it is essential. Ceremonial precedence meant the order in which royals are positioned, acknowledged, seated, and visually ranked during official occasions. It may look minor from the outside. Inside the monarchy, it is one of the clearest expressions of institutional reality. Who stands where, who enters with whom, who is named in what order, and who appears in which capacity are not casual details. They are the monarchy, speaking through arrangement. During those preparations, according to accounts long whispered but rarely surfaced so directly, palace staff encountered deep confusion over how Harry's presence should be framed if future contact became more regular. Was he family first and always? Of course. But was he also to be handled operationally as a non-working royal whose public role could not be presumed? Yes. Could exceptions be made for personal occasions? Possibly. But could those exceptions begin to erode the clear distinction the palace had tried to draw since his departure? That was the danger. One senior aide reportedly argued that vagueness was creating its own crisis. Another insisted that over-definition would look cruel. The official household was the machinery that translated emotion into protocol. Private secretaries, communications staff, ceremonial officers, legal advisors, and senior figures whose task was to ensure that the monarchy functioned even when the family did not. But on Harry, the machine kept stalling. Too much distance looked heartless. Too much openness looked unstable. The palace had been trying to inhabit both messages at once. Charles knew it could not last. What truly changed the emotional climate, however, was not staffing confusion. It was a private family encounter that followed. Harry, by some accounts, had expected concern. He had not expected the depth of institutional alarm that now met even routine discussions about his future involvement. What he saw as family channels, others increasingly saw as risk channels. That matters because one of the deepest tragedies in this entire story is that both sides often believed they were defending something essential. Harry believed he was defending dignity, autonomy, and truth. The institution believed it was defending continuity, trust, and survivability. No one raised their voice, but the damage deepened. In that private confrontation, believed to have taken place during a period of particularly fragile communication, William is said to have been sharper than Charles, not because he felt less love, but because he felt less room for illusion. He had spent years watching the consequences of royal instability unfold across generations. He understood that the crown survives not through emotion alone, but through confidence in the system that carries it. A monarchy may survive argument. It may survive scandal. But it cannot survive endless ambiguity over who speaks for it, who benefits from it, who critiques it, and who may at any moment be drawn back toward it. Charles, more torn, is said to have tried to preserve some measure of paternal softness. Yet even he recognized that repeated cycles of limited contact, public fallout, speculation, and then renewed emotional pressure were draining the dignity of everyone involved. It was not simply painful, it was unsustainable. The family remained wounded, the institution remained exposed, and Harry's future remained suspended in a fog that allowed every new development to be interpreted as either a path back in or another step further out. That is the kind of uncertainty monarchies fear. Because uncertainty feeds factions, it feeds stories, it feeds public misunderstanding, and above all, it feeds the impression that there may be more than one center of legitimacy within a single royal house. The monarchy could survive many things, but not prolonged confusion about where authority ended and emotional claim began. It was around this period, according to palace observers, that the first serious work began on what would eventually become the letter. Not perhaps as a weapon, more as a necessity. Advisors close to the king are believed to have concluded that verbal understandings were no longer enough. Too much had been assumed, too much had been reinterpreted, too many conversations existed only in memory, where pain distorts sequence and silence acquires contradictory meanings. Written language, by contrast, creates a record. It is colder, yes, but it is also clearer. A private palace letter of this kind would not be mere correspondence. It would function as a framework. A framework in royal terms is a document that establishes expectations, conditions, and principles without necessarily being published as policy. It allows the sovereign to set moral and operational boundaries while preserving some personal dignity around the matter. That was important here. Charles was not merely dealing with an errant relative. He was dealing with his son. Any document had to serve the crown without humiliating the father. Yet the drafting process itself is believed to have exposed how deep the internal divide had become. Some advisors wanted precision so strict that there could be no future misunderstanding over Harry's role, access, representation, or expectations. Others warned that excessive rigidity would turn a family wound into an institutional exile. A few reportedly argued for language that preserved a narrow path toward future reconciliation, under clearly defined conditions. That phrase matters, clearly defined conditions. It means the monarchy had moved from emotional hope to managed possibility. And still, the letter remained unseen. For a long time, it may have existed only as draft language, revised with care, discussed in partial terms, linked to other planning around the future shape of the working monarchy. The working monarchy was the smaller, active core of royals who carry out public duties on behalf of the crown. It had already been moving toward a leaner model. Harry's departure accelerated the pressure to define who was in and who was out, not just socially, functionally, symbolically, financially, ceremonially. But before the letter could become decisive, another triggering incident reportedly forced Charles's hand. This incident did not take place in public. It emerged from a chain of concern involving private communications, scheduling assumptions, and what palace figures interpreted as a dangerous mismatch between Harry's expectations and the institution's current reality. The details remain heavily guarded, but those familiar with the broader pattern suggest that Harry may have still believed certain forms of family recognition, access, or future relevance could be preserved on a more fluid basis than the palace was prepared to allow. To him, this may have felt humane. To the institution, it felt perilous, because every undefined opening becomes a future dispute. That was when Charles finally accepted what he had resisted for as long as he could. Love was no longer enough as a management strategy. He needed a line, not shouted, not dramatized, written. The letter, according to those who now speak of it with unusual seriousness, did several things at once. It reportedly affirmed Harry's place in the family by blood and personal affection. That mattered, because total rejection was never the king's instinct. Yet it also clarified that royal future did not mean automatic institutional future. Those two things had been dangerously conflated for too long. A prince may remain beloved. That does not mean he remains operationally central. He may remain the king's son. That does not mean he remains indefinitely suspended near the machinery of state as though nothing fundamental has changed. This was not a cancellation of kinship. It was a redefinition of proximity. And that distinction would change everything. The palace letter is understood to have drawn a sharper line between family belonging and royal function. Family belonging meant Charles was not disowning Harry, nor pretending he did not exist, nor denying the emotional bond that can survive even after deep breach. Royal function, however, meant representation, duty, trust, protocol, coordinated messaging, institutional responsibility, and the ability to act within the crown's orbit without destabilizing it. One could exist without the other. The family had resisted saying that too plainly for years. The letter forced the truth into language. The first people outside the immediate drafting orbit to grasp its significance reportedly reacted with stunned quiet. Senior household officials understood that if revealed, the letter would be interpreted as a verdict on Harry's future. Not necessarily a final goodbye, but certainly the end of fantasy. There would be no more easy assumptions that time alone would restore an earlier version of royal inclusion. If Harry were ever to stand near the center again, it would not be by emotional gravity. It would be by terms the palace could defend. William, once informed more fully, is believed to have supported clarity even if he felt no triumph in it. That mattered because this was not a brother settling a score. It was the future king accepting that unmanaged sentiment is dangerous when placed too near the line of succession. Succession is the lawful transfer of the crown from one heir to the next, but it also depends on public confidence that the institution knows where its boundaries lie. If those boundaries blur, speculation grows, and when speculation grows, authority weakens. Catherine's role in the matter was quieter, but still important. She has long represented a form of continuity built on steadiness, not volatility. In moments like this, the palace looks not only at what is said, but at what the future will feel like to the public. If William and Catherine embody ordered continuity, then uncertainty around Harry becomes not merely a family sadness, but a contrast problem. The public begins to compare two models of royal life, one bound to service and structure, the other bound to grievance and distance. That comparison is painful for the family, but politically useful for institutional planning, and everyone in the palace knows it. Yet the most devastating element was still to come. Because the letter did not remain buried. At some point, and likely after mounting pressure from within the family over how future contact could be handled, Charles chose to reveal it, not necessarily in full, not necessarily in a theatrical reading, but enough to make clear that written guidance existed and that Harry's royal future had already been thought through in more concrete terms than the public realized. This was the moment everything changed, not because a new punishment had been invented, but because private hesitation was replaced by documented intention. The silence deepened across the family. Anne, it is said, regarded the development with a kind of stern sorrow. She has little patience for confusion disguised as kindness. To her, perhaps, a hard truth stated clearly is often kinder than prolonged ambiguity. But even she would have understood what it meant for a reigning monarch to reveal such a letter about his own son. It meant that the informal era was over. Camilla's reaction, according to some close readings of palace mood, was measured and private. She knew better than most how public narratives can flatten personal complexity into simple blame. She also knew Charles's instinct was rarely cruelty. If he had come this far, he had likely done so only after exhausting softer paths. But that did not make the act painless. The revelation of the letter would inevitably be read by some as institutional coldness, by others as overdue firmness, and by many as proof that the family divide had finally entered an irreversible stage. Harry, of course, stood at the center of the storm, whether present or not. And here the emotional stakes became almost unbearable, because the country saw a prince's future being redefined. But somewhere behind that public interpretation was also a son learning, or being forced to accept, that his father had put into durable form what could no longer be negotiated through feeling alone. That is not just disappointing, it is shattering. Not because it ends love, but because it makes love operate under written limits. He had expected disappointment. He had not expected documentation. And that is why the revelation struck so hard. A father can say something in anger. A family can cool off. A difficult conversation can be revisited. But once a palace letter exists, once it is known and acknowledged, it changes the emotional architecture of the whole relationship. The archive enters the wound. Memory becomes record. Hope must now move through terms. As the reality of the letter spread through senior circles, palace machinery began adjusting quickly. Constitutional advisors were drawn into adjacent conversations, not because Harry's place directly threatened the line of succession, but because the management of royal status affects public confidence in the crown's coherence. Constitutional tension is not always about laws being broken. Often it is about appearances drifting so far from structure that the public no longer knows what the institution stands for. The palace could not afford that drift any longer. Private secretaries reviewed future event models. Security expectations were reconsidered in practical terms. Communications staff revisited language around family appearances, commemorative gatherings, and official acknowledgments. The Lord Chamberlain's world of ceremonial order came closer to the matter too. Not because Harry would suddenly vanish from all royal association, but because every possible future scenario now needed a clearer script. Birthdays, funerals, memorials, anniversaries, and major state moments all raise the same painful question. Where does personal family inclusion end and public royal function begin? The letter had not answered everything, but it had changed how every future answer would be framed. Then came the leak. Not a complete leak. Not a photograph of the letter spread across front pages. Something more subtle and therefore more believable. A whisper that the king had relied on a written palace communication to redefine Harry's future standing. A suggestion that boundaries once assumed to be emotional had now been formalized. A murmur that family contact might remain possible while institutional reintegration had been narrowed almost beyond recognition. That was enough to ignite the national reaction. Broadcasters interrupted regular discussion to turn back to the royal story with renewed urgency. Newspaper editors moved rapidly, sensing that this was not just another chapter in a long feud, but a development with deeper implications. Commentators revived every old question about whether Harry had truly left, been pushed, or become impossible to place. Crowds gathered near royal gates once again, not because they expected answers from inside, but because Britain understands instinctively when the monarchy is dealing with one of its own most intimate fractures. The headlines came fast. Some declared that Charles had finally drawn the line. Others said the letter sealed Harry's fate. Some framed it as heartbreaking clarity, others as necessary discipline. But beneath all those competing interpretations ran a single, unmistakable current. The royal future Harry once carried by default was now conditional, limited, and perhaps permanently transformed. And still the palace moved with care. A state communication was discussed, perhaps drafted in versions, perhaps held back in full, because the danger of saying too much remained severe. If the palace confirmed every implication, it would turn a family injury into a constitutional drama of open record. If it denied too much, it would undermine the seriousness of what Charles had already revealed privately. The monarchy often survives by choosing language that is less satisfying than the truth, but more stable than emotional honesty. Yet in this case, Even that skill looked strained. William reportedly saw the moment for what it was, not revenge, not closure, but transition. The future relationship between Harry and the institution had entered a new phase. Whatever affection remained, whatever private contact might still exist, the old uncertainty had been narrowed. The future king is said to have believed that painful clarity now was better than years more of speculative theater. Because theater drains institutions. It leaves everyone playing versions of themselves while nothing stabilizes underneath. Harry's defenders, naturally, would see the matter differently. They would say the institution had chosen control over reconciliation, that the palace had finally given written form to what it had long felt but dared not state openly. That a man born into a system he never chose was now being told precisely how little room remained for him inside it. And there is pain in that reading, real pain, because the monarchy's greatest strength, continuity, can feel merciless when turned against individual emotional need. Yet the palace's defenders would answer with a harder truth of their own. Trust, once broken repeatedly in a system built on discretion, does not repair itself through sentiment. A royal household functions because people know what will remain private, what role each person serves, and what authority each person may exercise. If that certainty collapses, the whole structure becomes vulnerable. In that view, the letter was not cruelty. It was institutional self-preservation, written by a father who had waited too long to admit that preservation now required formality. This was not a simple story of good and bad. It was a story of incompatible truths, living in the same bloodline. That is what made it so gripping to the public, and so painful to the family. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. A father still loved his son. A son still felt wronged by the family. A brother no longer trusted instability near the future crown. A monarchy no longer believed it could afford ambiguity. All of that could be true at once, and all of it could still end in a letter. Late in the day, another private exchange reportedly took place, one that many believe will matter more in the long run than the initial revelation itself. Charles and William, alone or nearly so, are said to have discussed not Harry's past, but the shape of future mercy. That mattered because even boundaries require interpretation. A line written today still has to be lived tomorrow. Funerals still come. Illness still comes. Family still exists. The question was not whether Harry had a future near the crown in the old sense. The letter had already narrowed that. The question was whether the monarchy could remain firm without becoming spiritually empty. That is the burden of kingship. The crown asks for continuity, but continuity without humanity becomes brittle. Charles, by all serious accounts, knows this. He knows the institution must endure. He also knows history will not be kind if duty becomes indistinguishable from emotional abandonment. So the letter, while restrictive, may also have preserved one hidden principle that has gone underappreciated amid the shock. It did not erase family feeling. It simply refused to let family feeling define royal function on its own. That final distinction is the one that changes Harry's future most of all. Because his future, as now understood, may still include moments of personal contact, family recognition, and bloodline dignity. But it no longer rests on the assumption that he can drift in and out of royal centrality, depending on circumstance, sympathy, or public mood. The monarchy has chosen clarity over elasticity, preparation over denial, structure over hope unsupported by trust. By evening, the symbolic scene that many will remember had taken shape. Charles, weary but composed, appeared briefly in a setting that conveyed continuity rather than triumph. William was near enough to reinforce order without dramatizing alignment. No smiles for show, no gestures of theatrical relief. Just the unmistakable image of a monarchy closing ranks, not against a stranger, but around a wound it could no longer leave untreated. And somewhere, beyond the cameras, beyond the gates, beyond the formal language and carefully measured faces, remained Harry himself, the prince whose royal future had once seemed limitless and now appeared bounded by a letter from his father. That is what gave the story its sting. Not punishment, not gossip, loss. The loss of ease, the loss of assumption, the loss of a future once carried by birthright and now conditioned by trust that may never be fully restored. The story did not end with the revelation. It was reframed by it. Because this was not merely the king speaking about his son. It was the monarchy speaking about what it can and cannot absorb without changing shape. It was an acknowledgement that family alone cannot solve a structural problem. It was a painful declaration that affection may survive where operational confidence does not. And it was, perhaps, Charles's most difficult message yet, that Prince Harry's future may still contain a place in the family, but no longer an undefined claim on the institution. This was not banishment in the medieval sense. It was something more modern, and in some ways, more heartbreaking. A managed distance, a recognized blood tie paired with a narrowed royal horizon. A son still present in memory and lineage, yet no longer central to the system his birth once placed around him. The monarchy could survive many things, but not endless uncertainty over its own boundaries. That is the conclusion Charles appears to have reached, and if so, then the palace letter changes everything, not because it ends the relationship, but because it names its new terms. In the end, the greatest shock was not that a letter existed. It was that the king allowed the truth behind it to surface. After years of half-open doors and unfinished sentences, he chose written clarity over emotional ambiguity. He chose the future over delay. He chose, however reluctantly, to acknowledge that love and duty could no longer remain in the same form. The family remains wounded. The pain is not resolved. The brotherhood is not restored by protocol. The fatherhood is not healed by paper. But the future, at least now, is less hidden than it was before. Prince Harry's royal future has changed because the palace has finally admitted that the old one is gone. And that may be the hardest royal truth of all. Not every prince loses his place through one dramatic act. Some lose it gradually, through distance, mistrust, history, and the quiet arrival of a letter that says what everyone feared, but no one wanted to put into words. The crown endures by defining itself. The family suffers when that definition cuts close to the heart. This time, it cut very close indeed. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.